My name is Alexa Dalby, and I will be sharing my policy change project on the school to prison pipeline and Assembly Bill 420 in the state of California. And I will share my screen. Okay. So a little bit of description and background on the school to prison pipeline. This started as an effort to create a safe educational environment by implementing zero tolerance policies. But over several decades, the punishments became harsher and also easier to achieve. Overly punitive punishments led to a higher school dropout and a higher likelihood to turn to crime after school. Children are currently and historically being punished for behavior that they are likely seeing at home. Being in school should be considered a safe environment, but instead it is full of punitive and very harsh punishments for what would normally be considered pretty average adolescent behavior. And again, school should be a place where children receive support. It should not be a place where they are afraid to go to. So the history, more into the history, the introduction of police in schools started in the 1950s. The practice arose out of a community-oriented policing philosophy, which emphasized a proactive and prevention-oriented approach to policing. Over the next several decades, more communities kind of began getting on board with this, and they implemented police presence in their own schools. In the 1980s, the media began creating mass hysteria with their increasing reports on youth gang violence. And much like today, what was being reported and what was actually happening were very different. As a result, state and federal legislation was enacted through the 1990s and early 2000s that increased punitive outcomes for many adolescents, including trying more as adults, expanding the severity of penalties, and minimizing rehabilitative alternatives. California Assembly Bill 420, this aims to reduce the number of suspensions issued to students for willful defiance. This was passed actually back in 2014. Prior to its passage, California allowed for children to be suspended or expelled pretty much at the school principal or in a superintendent's discretion. So if they felt the student committed an act of willful defiance and they kind of got to decide what willful defiance looked like because it was not clearly defined and still really isn't clearly defined, it was up to them to decide and hand down that punishment for very broad definitions of what would be considered offenses. The purpose of the bill is to eliminate the authority to suspend and recommend expulsion for kids K through 12 due to willful defiance. So Dangner actually argues that the willful defiance standard needs work, and I agree. It either must be eliminated or as a term for disciplinary action, or the term really needs to be redefined. And I do agree with Dangner on that because this would suggest outlining accountability measures and allocating funding for training to ensure students are afforded equal protection, which is what my policy project is about. My advocacy group is called California for Punitive Punishment Education. This is an advocacy group that seeks to add mandatory ongoing training for all staff within the education system, starting with superintendents, principals, school social workers, guidance counselors, teachers and aides, and office staff. We want educators to be provided with enough training and ongoing information so they feel completely equipped to support students, so that these students who are coming to school, they feel that this is a place for them to feel relief from what is going on at home, if that's the case, instead of a place where they'll be handed down punishment, because they should know that their educators are equipped with the tools they need to support them. This would work to involve government officials on the state level, and it would be considered an institutional policy change because it would hopefully involve a shift in the way the organization functions. So our goals on the short term, we have the short-term goal, which is increase awareness by meeting monthly via Zoom with a goal of 100 participants by the 6-month mark. The intermediate term would be that we will begin inviting legislators to those monthly Zoom meetings, as well as hopefully local in-person meetings with a goal to have legislator buy-in by the 1-year mark. And then our long-term goal would be to introduce an amendment to AB 420 in the 2023 legislative session, with, of course, the long-term final goal of it being passed. So grassroots tactic, this is where we gather people, engage we gauge what the interest looks like. We begin asking people what their personal involvement is. We want stories from people. We want to see what people who have personally experienced these issues feel about ongoing mandatory training for educators. The persuasive tactic would be that we involve legislators and we begin inviting them to our meetings and resolve differences between them and our constituents. And then demonstrative, we, at this time during the 2023 legislative session, is where we drive home the point, is where we take everything we've done with the grassroots and the persuasive tactics, and we drive home this public concern and need for this amendment. Our tools. So first, we'll use social media. This is where we get the word out. People feel comfortable speaking and talking about their personal stories on social media. Zoom information, community centers, really getting the word out there. Second, we have fact sheets. We know that legislators are busy. We want them to look at something that's clean, that looks visually appealing, that is not something that they will turn over or throw away. We want a one-page fact sheet with our most staggering statistics. And then our testimonies during the legislative session, we want verbal and written testimony prepared ideally by everyone in our advocacy group. So for implementation, our advantages is we have allies that can include former and current educators, staff, families, students, and they bring real life experience. Also, the current political climate in California supports gaining sufficient constituency, who will be open to our change efforts. And we're at an advantage because we have these staggering statistics that will support what we are saying. But our challenges, of course, fundraising can only go so far. 2023 is only less than 2 years away. And so we are up against the clock. And we don't know what our resources look like because we're unsure as far as what kind of support we will gain from people on the local level, our constituents, and political figures. We'll also need more information about what it takes to reach every legislator out there. We know that email doesn't work for everyone, texting doesn't work for everyone. We have to figure out what does work for each person. And then we need to make sure that our budget is realistic. Our threats, of course, we have the more fiscally conservative politicians who will feel that this is not fiscally responsible to have ongoing mandatory training. And we know that there will be citizens who do not have school-age children and they'll feel that this issue does not touch them and we may not have their support. But we have opportunities. This is during COVID. We know that Zoom is something that a lot of people have become comfortable with, and we can reach a lot more people using that platform. Also, social media. People are really using social media these days to express their opinion, to find information, and people feel a lot more comfortable on social media these days. So we can capitalize on that. And then we are likely to support our policy change with these students and families who have experienced injustice, as well as veteran staff who've seen how policies have changed over the years. Excuse me. So next steps, we need to design a budget that's modest but allows room for growth. We need to develop a guide that provides us with specific insight into reaching as many politicians and constituents as possible. We need to make sure our data is solid. We know we have it, so it's about organizing it. We need to create a timeline that's realistic, as well as a backup timeline. And we need to create a plan for engagement strategies, specifically for gaining support from those people who feel this issue does not touch them. So the work that I've done thus far, June 25th, my short-term grassroots tactic, I used Facebook and I chose the Ask a Question feature just to gauge interest. And I received quite a bit of feedback from people on with regards to personal stories, as well as former educators and even current educators that I stay in touch with who were able to provide some insight. Moving forward, I think due to COVID, an in-person meetup was risky, but in the future, planning a coffee hour or something community-oriented would be a better idea. On July 15th, the intermediate goal with the persuasive tactic was that I created a fact sheet and I purposely emailed it to California Senators Dianne Feinstein and Alex Padilla. They are the oldest and newest senators respectively, and I wanted to see if I would receive a difference in their response. I did not receive a response from either yet. I think moving forward, it would be beneficial to email as many senators as possible and keep track of the difference in their responses. And lastly, on the 26th of July, my long-term goal with the demonstrative tactic was that I wrote my own testimony and emailed it to my state senator here in Connecticut. So I have written many testimonies before, but never on this issue. And this was more my goal to feel empowered to begin speaking about other states and what was going on in the state of California, since I'm not a resident there, but I am comfortable writing testimonies in my own state. I received an automatic response, but nothing further yet. In the future, I think this is where the budgeting would come into play. I think that writing a testimony, though it may seem easy, can actually it can make somebody feel very flustered. And I think workshops on how to prepare a testimony, both written and verbal, would be very beneficial. So while I didn't complete my goals to the extent I had desired or planned, I was able to begin chipping away, and this was actually very empowering for me. Even though I didn't receive responses from people, I can see where I could do better. And then in contrast with the Act On assessment, I mistakenly assumed that the current political climate in California would kind of mean that I would garner this immediate support from senators, but I didn't receive responses yet. At the same time, it was a relatively short time frame, and I only emailed 2 senators. The grassroots approach, or tactic, I should say, was extremely beneficial. I was correct that, due to COVID, I think people are very comfortable with Zoom, even though I didn't use that yet. I did see that people are very receptive to online engagement and involvement. People were very comfortable sharing details on social media, and it was a good place to start, and again, very empowering. The demonstrative tactic, as mentioned, using the Act On model, budget constraints would play a big role. And I do think that we would need a budget to properly support and teach people how to write a testimony and how to give a testimony in person. So in conclusion, even though this was small in comparison to what would have to happen in order to see larger scale change, it was very eye-opening to see kind of what the process would look like from beginning to end. Probably the biggest frustration was that I didn't get a response, but I was also being a little impatient and not realistic in how much time I really should give people. Legislators are sifting through emails, I'm sure, every day and cannot respond as quickly as I would like. So in the future, I would really have to plan for that. As a future social worker and someone interested in policy change, this made me realize the importance of grassroots tactics. And I likened it, as somebody who loves to go to concerts, I likened it to being somebody who sits in the nosebleed section. I often sit in the way back. I get the cheapest tickets a lot of the time. I feel like that's where the truest fans are. That's where you get the best experience. And it was immediately what I thought of when I thought of grassroots tactics. This is where you get the raw, real information that you actually need. This is where you get the data that you're trying to put out there. Without this, you don't have anything to support your cause. And I will absolutely, I think it was the biggest impact overall in this whole project, and something that I will take with me absolutely in my future practice. At the same time, I do need to keep in mind that I didn't do much in the way of budgeting, and I will really have to keep that in mind when I am moving forward in any sort of policy change involvement that I have in the future. And attached, please see the sources that I used. Thank you very much.